What's going on, Grace Church? Thank you for tuning in with us today. My name is Brayden Marsh, and I want to tell you a story about a friend that I've had since high school. Several years ago, he came up to me and said, Brayden, I want to progress in my fitness journey. And something you may not know about me is I am a huge nerd. Not a nerd in the sense that I don't have any friends and I live in a basement. A nerd in the sense that I really like to know stuff about stuff, basically just for the sake of knowing stuff. And one of those things that's had become a huge passion of mine was just exercise science and fitness. And so he came to me and said, I want to progress in my fitness journey. I've been struggling to stay consistent. I've been struggling to figure out how to make results when it comes to going to the gym and my nutrition. And I was like, all right, cool, we can figure this out together. I would take him to the gym with me. We would work out kind of like a diet plan for him. But I remember it would always take a few weeks, maybe at the most a month, for things to kind of go sideways and for him to call me one day and say, hey, I'm completely off track. We basically need to start over. And this was kind of the cycle that we went through for quite some time until one day he called me back. But instead of saying, I've fallen off the rails, he said, hey, I tried this thing called CrossFit. And I remember immediately my reaction was, oh man, that's not what you should have done. You don't go to the dark side, right? Lift weights like a normal person. But he was so fired up about it. He would tell me, I don't know, this CrossFit thing, these people, they're so dedicated to it. And instead of me trying to have to motivate myself and stay on track with my own fitness program, I can just go to this place and these people will yell at me for an hour and we throw weights around and I get a really effective workout. And even though it was to my great dismay, it ended up being the thing that helped him be successful in his fitness journey. It was the thing, the catalyst for him going from, I can't figure this thing out, I hate it, I don't like working out, I can't stay consistent, to now all of a sudden he's integrated into this way of doing things where he's very effective and he's able to stay on track. And I wonder, have you ever experienced that where there was something that you just hated, you couldn't stand the thought of it, but then you tried it and you ended up loving it? I think that this is the story for a lot of Christians. They could not stand the idea of being roped in or identified with other Christians, with this thing being, with what Christianity is. That they wanted nothing to do with it because of the reputation they thought that it had. Until whatever it was made them try it out. Until they realized that Christianity is actually not about Christians. It's about Christ. It's about Jesus. And even though other people, plenty of people, they still hate it. They can't stand it. That they saw what was so amazing about it. And that was the thing that led them to becoming a Christian, a Jesus follower. Well, today, we're going to be looking at the last of the 3 Beatitudes. We're going through this series called The Good Life, and we're essentially asking the big question, what does Jesus say about the kind of person that he wants us to be? What kind of people is Jesus trying to form? In Matthew chapter 5, we have the most famous sermon ever preached by Jesus himself called the Sermon on the Mount. And the Beatitudes are really addressing things that are broken within the world. And Jesus has radical ways of suggesting these things are fixed for us. We saw in the first week with the first set of the Beatitudes that the good life, those who receive blessing, are actually the ones who seem the farthest from it, who people would categorize as the worst kind of people, the lowest in society. That those are the people who are actually most ready to accept the life that Jesus has to offer. And then last week, we saw that the good life is for the hungry and the unsatisfied. The good life is for people who are unsatisfied, are not okay with the disorder and the broken relationships that we see in our world right now. And today we're going to be seeing that the good life is for the peacemakers. In Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 9, we're going to be looking at the last 3 Beatitudes. Jesus has this to say, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you, falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Today we're going to be looking at 4 points that show us how the good life is for the peacemakers. Point number 1 is that peace has to be made. When Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he's implying something, that peace has to be made. Now, I think we have some misconceptions about what peace is. I think that we tend to think that peace is just the opposite of war or of conflict. We tend to think that peace is just defeating the bad guy. Maybe we think that peace is simply avoiding conflict altogether. But one thing that is definitely true is that peace does not occur naturally. Peace is not the natural state of things. So what is peace? Peace is intentional. But just like everything else that Jesus says in the Beatitudes, the way that we get there is so counterintuitive to how we think naturally. I think it's going to help to look at the context in which Jesus is preaching this in. Jesus lives in an occupied, militarized zone. He lives in Jerusalem, but has been taken over by the Roman Empire. I think it's helpful for us to wrap our heads around the concept of living within our hometown, but yet our government structure has been taken over, completely dominated by another governing force. It is hard enough for us to live in a society where whoever's at the top isn't somebody that we agree with. But we live in a republic where we are fortunate enough to be able to elect new leaders every year, every 4 years, right? There's a cycle that happens to where even though you don't like who's in office now, eventually there'll be an opportunity for us to change that. But imagine that one day you wake up in a foreign country has come in and taken over, and they've imposed their government structure onto us, right? They've implemented very high taxes on the people that they're occupying, and almost all of that goes to benefit those who are taking over. And they've also completely done away with our system of government, where we don't have the freedom to elect the people who are ruling over us anymore. This is where Jesus finds himself in the context in which he's teaching. Because of this, there had been a very prominent idea that God's plan for his people, for the Jewish nation, was to overthrow this occupying government system. And that he was going to do that with the help of his Messiah. This was the mindset that was so popular in Jesus' day. But that was not what Jesus' message was, right? There were plenty of people who wanted Jesus to lead this uprising. And the thing is that he could have, right? Jesus had the capability to do that because he was popular. He was gaining traction. There were people that supported what he was doing and wanted to follow him. But instead, he talks about how you should live in a way that creates peace, even to the point to where we are mistreated. So how do we make peace? Well, I think in order to do that, we have to enter into conflict. We can't ignore the brokenness that we see around us. And I think this can be difficult for us in many different ways. And I think one of the most prominent ways that it's hard for us is because we have to leave behind our opinion of who is right and who is wrong. Jesus wants us to resolve conflict in the kinds of ways that don't give into the aggression, right? That don't feed one side or another. Jesus wants us to find creative ways to bring about resolution and peace within conflict that we come in contact with in relationships in our lives. But this leads us to the point number 2. And it's that making peace is hard. Right? Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. Entering into conflict can be dangerous. Right? It can be difficult to lean into these kinds of disputes because they can often be aggressive or hostile. They can be deeply ingrained into whichever side has been created against the other. But I think Jesus includes for righteousness' sake very intentionally. Right? Because when we are persecuted, the motives that we have behind what we're trying to accomplish become so important. Because when we try to make peace for righteousness' sake, this is very different than just trying to show somebody that they're right or that they're wrong. What we saw last week is that righteousness is living with right relationships. Because you can receive pushback, you can experience conflict, and it can be for good reasons. Right? If you are unkind, if you're a bully in the way that you try and show somebody that what they're doing is not peaceful, in your way to impose what you would call righteousness on the situation, and someone calls you out on it, right? Someone tries to point out to you the ways in which you're going about this that are contrary to what Jesus teaches us, and you turn around and say, look, I'm being persecuted. Look at me. My cause must clearly be righteous because I'm receiving persecution for trying to step into the situation. That is not the kind of peace that Jesus is trying to, that Jesus is showing us is possible, that Jesus is trying to point us towards. So we have to examine, what are our motives? Why do we want to make peace? And this leads us to point number 3, that making peace gets personal. Jesus says, blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Right? Jesus is basically saying the good life is for the hated. The good life is for people who are so despised and who are reviled, persecuted. How good is life for you when people hate you for what you're trying to do? The question is, who would want that kind of life? How can we get from a place, how can we get to the place where we see that kind of life as good? Well, Jesus is trying to prepare us to be misunderstood. He's trying to get us to count the cost for what this kind of life will bring us, for what peacemaking has. And I think it's so profound. Jesus is basically telling us that the cost is our reward. The punishment is the solution. That they will hate us because they hated him. This is how the early church was successful. This is how the Jesus movement, which was called the Way at the time, when you read through the book of Acts, we see time and time again that the church was successful, not because they imposed their way of thinking on another group of people who disagreed with them. The church was successful because they made peace. Paul is a beautiful example of how this can be lived out in our lives. Because he too lived in that same time of division and conflict and hostility among different people groups. Paul was repeatedly arrested, beaten, his life threatened for preaching the message of Jesus as he went from town to town. I want to key in on one of these examples because it shows us just an amazing picture of how this can actually be lived out as we go about preaching the message of Jesus and seeking to make peace in our relationships and our situations. Acts 22 through 26 is basically one big story of Paul going to a synagogue and preaching the message of Jesus. And as he is leaving, his message is so offensive to the people that he's preaching to that they become a mob that riots against him, right? And they want to tear him to pieces. This gained so much attention from the Roman authorities that they rush to the scene and they arrest Paul for creating this uprising, and they want him to stand trial for what he's done. So they bring him to the Roman authorities. The thing is that the Jewish leaders wanted Paul dead probably more than anybody else, because he was a traitor to them. Right? He betrayed their way of living because he was once like them. And instead of upholding the structure that they've created, he's trying to undermine everything that they've worked so hard for by preaching this Jesus character who can radically change the type of life that they've created. So he's brought in front of Roman officials to stand trial. But the thing is, when Paul gives his defense, they can't find any reason to punish him, because his message is very simple. His message is Jesus was crucified and now he's alive again. And they hear him give this defense and they're like, what could be so harmful? Like, why is this creating such a disturbance? Why are there riots outside these temples over this guy's message? And I think herein lies the paradox of what it means to be a Christian. Because the message that Jesus died for everybody and wants us to abandon our old way of living, wants us to see him as our Savior, recognize our sin for what it is, and die to ourselves so that we might live for him, that message is offensive. Right. I think proclaiming this message is oftentimes even considered aggressive. But this is the kind of conflict that God is okay with. Because this message, when it's presented, even though it's offensive, the way in which it's presented makes all the difference. Because you can present an offensive message to somebody with kindness and compassion. And this is what Paul did so well. One of the things as you read through the book of Acts that's so funny to me is you will see pages and pages about the interactions, the conflict, the disagreements, and then the violence that's incited because of what Paul is preaching. And then you see chapters of his interaction with different authorities trying to give his defense. Right? Even pitting certain groups against each other so that he can show them all you care about is retaining power. All you care about is being right. But then so many times when we get to the very end of one of these stories, there'll be just one little sentence and it'll say something to the effect of, and that day many were saved. And that day many came to the Lord. But yet that is the most important part of any of those stories. Right? We see lengthy descriptions of just these dramatic events that play out when Paul is preaching the message of Jesus. But the most important thing that happens is that final sentence. When it says, but yet even though there was a lot of conflict, even though many people radically disagreed with him to the point where they wanted him dead, because that's how much of a threat his message was to the way of life that they had created for themselves, it was clearly working. Because even though there were some people who hated what he had to say, there was a huge amount of people who heard his message and believed it and saw it for what it was. And that can only be because of one reason. I would say it's the way that it was presented. Because the message of Jesus can be presented in a way that is not just offensive because it leads people to question the things that they've hold most important. It can be offensive because the only thing you're trying to do is prove that you're right. Because your main goal is for people to see that their ideologies, their way of living is wrong. That is not what Paul wanted to do. That was not what motivated him. So many times in his letters, when he's writing to churches, Paul is very adamant that you would let nothing hinder anybody from receiving the message of Jesus other than the message of Jesus. This is what it means to speak the truth in love. And this leads us to our fourth point, and it's key to all of this. In order for any of this to be possible for us, point number 4 is that only those who have peace can make peace. How is it that Paul could be hated, beaten, tried in court, threatened with death, and still desire to make peace? Because that is not a peaceful life. And side note here, striving for a peaceful life will rarely ever bring us peace. If what we are walking towards, if our focus in life is simply being able to have enough money for us to retire one day so that finally we can have some peace and quiet in our lives, we might get that. That might be what you get. But will you be at peace? Will you know peace in your heart and in your soul? Let me just say that I worked in the remodeling industry for many years. And most of my clients were people who were either in retirement or had just retired. And I mean, these were the kinds of people who could afford a very expensive remodel in their home. And rarely did I witness any of these people have any peace in their lives. Their lives were quote unquote peaceful, but they were miserable. That's why we have to ask ourselves, what is our focus? What are we striving for? Right? Paul's life was not peaceful, but he sought to make peace. Even though his message often offended people, his way of life brought so many others into the belief that Jesus is the only way. This reminds me of a great story that I heard from one of my friends who pastors a church. And he was telling me about this friend of his that he had known for many, many years. He was not a Christian. They had stayed pretty close, and he would often invite him to church. And there was one week when finally he decided, okay, I'm going to go. I'm going to show up. He comes, he attends the service, and he does this for 3 weeks in a row. And my friend was so excited that he came and he came back. But after that third week, he stopped coming. And I remember he told me a few weeks later, he called his friend up and he said he was so nervous for that conversation because the thing he was most expecting to hear was, I tried out your church, but I didn't fit in. Everyone just judged me. Right? I felt like it was the last place that I should have been. But that's not what he told him. His friend said, I went to your church and they were some of the nicest people I've ever met. I was welcomed by everybody. I was able to sit and I didn't feel awkward for being there. I didn't feel like I shouldn't be there. And my friend who's a pastor asked the question. He said, well, why did you stop coming? And he said, I just don't believe it. He said, I just don't believe in Christianity. I just don't believe in Jesus. Now, while that might sound like a sad story, that might not sound like the end result that we want. And while it's true, it's a beautiful example of how we should seek to be, one as a church, but also just as people. Because for him, he showed up to church and all of these unnecessary barriers were broken down. They didn't exist for him in that case. Right? He didn't show up and receive condemnation for looking the way that he did. He didn't show up and feel so out of place because there were all of these tight-knit groups that were just closed off. where he looked inside those doors and said, well, there's not a place for me there. He showed up. All of the barriers were broken down such that it was the message of Jesus that he had to confront with. The decision was placed in front of him whether he was going to receive what Jesus offers, the free gift of salvation, or he was going to continue living life on his own terms. And even though I think that an amazing seed was planted, right, in those few weeks that he decided to come to church, it was only possible because that congregation had decided, we're not going to let anything else but the message of Jesus alone be the thing that either brings people in or turns people away. And that is what Jesus is getting at when he said, blessed are those who make peace. Our goal as Grace Church should be that we want to be a kind of church where people can come into our doors, they can watch our services online, they can interact with us however they find us. And the thing that they walk away from, the thing that they think is the most important to us is the message of Jesus. Right? It's not, well, how were they dressed? Or what did their home life look like? Or what kind of things did they say? Or where did they sit? You know, did they know all the songs? Did they look the part? No, this is a person who needs the message of Jesus more than anything. And I firmly believe that this is only possible when we see Jesus for who he is. Just like with each week as we're looking through the Beatitudes, when we see Jesus for who he is, the one who fulfills the Beatitudes, will we have the capability to live this way? Because the Beatitudes present us with an impossible message, an impossible way of living. Right? This whole series could be called The Good Life is Impossible. Except for when we see Jesus for who he is. Because Jesus was a peacemaker. And Jesus was persecuted. He was hated and he was betrayed. And all of this led Jesus to be killed. He was crucified on the cross. And when he did that, he forfeited the kingdom. The thing that he said we would receive when we seek to make peace, he forfeited. But he did that for us so that we would be able to, so that we might make peace. And even though we might be persecuted, ours is the kingdom of heaven. We might see the kingdom of heaven realized, even here on earth. And that's only possible when we live the kind of life that seeks to make peace with others. And the only thing that will do that is the message of Jesus. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just want to just pray for those who can see situations in their lives where there's just so much strife and aggression and conflict. And even though we're tempted in those times to pick a side, because even though we can find ourselves having an opinion on who's right, maybe someone has been wronged and someone has done the wrong thing. God, I pray that instead of either just avoiding that conflict, instead of avoiding entering into that broken relationship, especially the ones that we're the most close to, God, that you would show us ways where we can seek to make peace the way that you did. God, I pray that we would just examine our own heart and our motives. And we would ask ourselves, what do we think it really means to make peace? What do we think it means to have peace? And we would see that the only answer to that is knowing Jesus. Is believing what he has done for us and seeing that only he can give us peace. And because he has done that for us, we can do that for others. So God, I pray that you would just show us ways that we can live that out in our daily lives. I thank you for such a beautiful example of what that looks like. God, would we just be heartbroken for the broken relationships that we see? And would we seek to make peace in our lives? I pray this in your holy name. Amen.